Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's Roundtable with the Legal Studies Cluster. We will be covering the topic of the Supreme Court's judgment on the EWS quota that came in very recently. So, before we start, I'll give you an overview about what are reservations and why were they introduced, what is the relevance of the Indira Sahani judgment. So, in their quest for creating a more inclusive society, many nations have embraced some form of affirmative action. Driven by concern for social justice and equity espoused in the Constitution, the post colonial Indian state embarked on the formulation and use of preferential policies referred to as positive discrimination or reservation. Such policies derive their legitimacy through constitutionally guaranteed rights, which allow for preferential treatment of certain sections of society by reserving a certain number of seats or positions in desirable institutions or occupation for members of groups that were underrepresented in such positions, to indemnify the historical injustices they have faced on account of the oppressive caste system. Reservations were introduced in 1950 for members of the underrepresented and historically discriminated scheduled caste and scheduled tribes to provide public employment and adequate political representation. Subsequently, socially and educationally backward communities called the other backward castes were also brought under its ambit. So, reservations in India were introduced primarily for four reasons: to rectify the past historical injustice against the backward classes, to ensure that equal representation can be seen from people belonging to all castes in the services under the state and the center, to provide an equal platform for everyone, irrespective of their caste, and to promote and advance the backward classes. In 2019, the 103rd Amendment to the Constitution was brought in by the government, which introduced 10% reservation for economically weaker sections belonging to the general and unreserved category. This will be our topic for discussion today. But let me place the important context, that is the Indira Sahani judgment. So, in the year 1979, Prime Minister Morarji Desai appointed the Second Backward Classes Commission under Article 340 of the Constitution. The commission was headed by B.P. Mandal, and the mandate was to investigate the status of the socially and educationally backward classes in India. And the commission submitted a report in 1980 which recommended 27% reservation in government jobs and institutions for the other backward classes. But this was only implemented when the Janata Dal came into power in 1989. And what followed was reservation and anti-reservation protests and also riots in many parts of the country. When the government action was challenged by the Supreme Court by way of a writ petition, the Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao brought in an order which increased the reservation limit to 37%, while including economically, socially, and educationally backward classes. So the case that was initially being tried by a 5-judge bench was then referred to a 9-judge constitutional bench. So it was held in the Indira Sahani case that under backward classes under Article 16, Clause 4 cannot be identified on the basis of economic criteria, but the caste system also needed to be considered. Backward classes in Article 16, Clause 4 were different from the socially and educationally backward classes mentioned in Article 15, Clause 4. So the concept of a creamy layer was laid down, and it was directed that such a creamy layer be excluded while identifying backward classes. And most importantly, reservations should not exceed 50%. Moreover, reservations and promotions would not be allowed. So the court in the Indira Sahani judgment tried to come up with a solution that was reasonable and struck a fine balance between society and the rights of the backward classes. Removing economic criteria as the sole determinant of classification was also a step in the right direction at that time, as was the exclusion of the creamy layer who had already benefited from affirmative action. So, placing that as the context, I'll come up with the first question of today's discussion. What does EWS reservation mean? Which sections of society are under this umbrella?
So EWS reservations directly refers to economically weaker sections of society. And while economic reservations were a concern for the Mandal Commission as well, it was one of three concerns. Economic backwardness was one of three concerns for the Mandal Commission when coming up with backward classes for reservation. What this new rule, the portrayal of this rule is as such that it tries to say that the reservations being introduced right now are for to upboost poorer sections of society and to kind of circumvent the creamy layer of SC/ST categories getting reservations and affirmative actions, getting the benefits of reservations and affirmative actions. But the fact of the matter is, the the rule in itself, the EWS bill in itself, kind of is discriminatory in the way that it only benefits those who are already not being benefited by SC/ST and OBC categories of reservation. I feel like this is a very important distinction, and even though the constant constitutionality of this is seriously, this needs to seriously be brought into question, because it is just by leaving out a section of society on the basis that they're already getting a section of reservations, it is still discriminating. Plus, the income level that has been that has been laid down in this law act does is much higher than what the actual reality of Indian lower class income level is. So these are certain things that need to be discussed before a law like this could have been brought forth.
Okay, so I'll move on to the next question. Why was this amendment introducing EWS quota challenged in the court? Basically, what were the main contentions of the petitioners?
Yeah, so I'll be talking about that. So some of the petitioners were the Janhit Abhiyan, Rajat Rajendra Agarwal, Youth for Equality, and another, Justice Wangila Iswaria. These were some of the petitioners that had actually challenged the constitutionality of the 103rd Amendment that was introducing EWS quotas for the reservations for the EWS, and it was basically mostly a twofold what resistance towards the amendment by saying that it explicitly excludes the SC and ST castes, and it violates the Indira Sahni judgment. So, with regards to the explicit exclusion of SC and ST, the problem was with the explicit exclusion, that the words that explicitly state that these will be excluded. The people receiving, sorry, the people under SC and SC that already received a certain amount of reservation will be explicitly excluded from being covered under the 103rd Amendment, which was introduced, which is introducing EWS. So it also violates the Indira Sahni judgment because it violates two aspects of it. Firstly, the 50% reservation cap that was set, and secondly, by introducing a reservation which is solely based on economic backwardness. So now, one of the articles points out that, as was seen in the case of the UPSC entrance exams, where the cutoffs for the EWS category were lower than that for the SC, STs, and OBCs, a person belonging to the latter category who is also economically disadvantaged will still not be able to avail the benefit of the EWS reservation, solely due to the fact that he or she belongs to an SC or ST or OBC category. So this was basically another point of disagreement that was brought about by the petitioners, is that it does not fall in line with what the founding fathers of the Constitution had meant to bring in when they suggested the reservation. That is, in order to rectify past injustice based on the systematic discrimination against the caste system in India, as well as representation of different castes in order to bring a diverse representation to the posts in public sectors as well. So it does not take into the fact that there are systemic and structural principles that are underlying and connecting various provisions of the Constitution, which only contemplate special treatment to certain classes that have been historically discriminated, backward, and underrepresented. The amendment is contrary to the Equality Code. So it also basically talks about another disagreement that was brought about, was that any other basis for positive discrimination referring to the EWS category, such as income, changes the width and identity of Articles 15 and 16 of the Equality Code. Creating reservations in favor of persons merely on the basis of income without reference to the social and educational backwardness or representation is eating up the rule of equality and opportunity. Another very relevant contention that was brought about was that economic backwardness in the Indian society is seen as a consequence of social and educational backwardness. So when you're not taking into account the social and educational backwardness and only taking into account the economic backwardness, it's sort of taking away from the people that are systematically discriminated every day. So you're taking into fact that you're protecting them from the consequence, but you're not addressing the root problem. So these were the main contentions that were given by the petitioners.
Shreya, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, sorry, I was unmuting. I think Arushi raised a very interesting point about the aim of the reservations themselves. That even that was something that even the Mandal Commission was keeping in mind while coming up with the reservations and for other class. Something they were keeping in mind was the fact that it's not just economically weaker. There has to be proof of social backwardness and educational attainment levels of educational attainment, and a similar lens needs to be applied because a lot of researchers have done the same to understand the EWS section. And the fact of the matter is, even when you take into account higher education is more pervasive in upper castes, even in economically weaker sections. Types of jobs, even the kind of jobs and the pay that these jobs receive, it's higher in these higher with upper castes in the economically weaker sections. So the caste boundaries are pervasive within this section of society as well. So how can a law that comes in uh, discriminate against a group if the EWS is supposed to protect the economically weaker sections, right? How is this alienating even more disadvantaged groups within itself? So Arushi, go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, so in line of what you just said, I just wanted to highlight this one sentence that actually stuck out to me when I was reading the judgment, that's the written submissions by the petitioners, that the imputed amendments aims to achieve an object of doing something indirectly which cannot be done directly. That is to benefit the general bourgeoisie class who used to be an oppressors of the classes protected under clauses 4 and 15, 4 and 5, sorry.
I think that's a rather poignant statement that summarizes a lot of what both of you have raised. So, moving on to the next question, what was the final verdict of the Supreme Court in the case of whether the challenge that was raised regarding the constitutionality of the EWS quota, and does introducing economic reservation stand in contention to the reason why reservations were adopted or introduced in the very first place?
Yeah. So the Supreme Court gave its judgment, which in this case where the constitutionality of the 103rd Amendment was questioned. So the judgment can be divided in two parts, which was the majority decision and the minority decision. So the majority upheld its constitutionality because it said the judgment didn't violate the basic structure of the Constitution, or it did not violate the promise of equality that the basic structure upholds. Moreover, the majority also clarified that the 50% ceiling limit of the reservation, which was mentioned in the Indra Sahane judgment, has not been violated because although it has been violated, but it was not fixed, it was flexible. So, because of that, there was no violation as such. And but to counter this point, the minority said that the reservations in the minority decision, the reservation in the very first place was brought in to counter injustice that has happened for a historically disadvantaged classes, and not just on the basis of their economic levels of economy or their affordability. So, because of that, the Supreme Court said that the minority judges said that the constitutionality, this will be unconstitutional. But the Supreme Court, but again, it can be argued that the main point of promising reservations was being disadvantaged, and a lot of classes are economically disadvantaged, and there has been a lot of they are facing a lot of issues, because of which this amendment was necessary. So the government promised them certain benefits, but it excludes the backward classes, as mentioned by Arushi, and as mentioned by Arushi, that it kinda excludes the SC and ST castes. So because of that, it seems discriminatory, because at as mentioned by Arushi again, at some level, even people belonging to the SC and ST castes are are mostly economically challenged. But at the same time, there would be someone from the general category who can avail these benefits despite being uh, a little less economically over. So it was all the Supreme Court questioned the government's decision to uh, brought in this amendment because this was basically a critique that how what is the logic, what is the basis for fixing the the criteria, the quota to a certain limit. They said did the provided in India, every state has a very different per capita income. How can we have a uniform quota through for the whole country? So because of that, even the Supreme Court criticized it, and it seems like a very important point because again, so a lot of people in a lot of states are earning differently, right? Because of that, we cannot put a similar level that okay for the whole country. So that was one of the critiques that the Supreme Court did. That's it. Thank you.
I think just stemming out of that, the idea of the EWS quota, the idea is good because you are ensuring that people who are disadvantaged in terms of economic abilities are being given an opportunity. But it's very hard to say what comes first: historical social discrimination, or recent, let's say, or generational economic disadvantages. So the idea of reservations in the first place was for socially disadvantaged sections of society. Otherwise, if you were to think of it, you can have quotas being set up for on a lot of factors. You can have quotas on the basis of gender, because then you say that okay, women have historically been more disadvantaged than men, and at the end of it, you can possibly create like multiple levels of um, reservations. So there'll be reservation for X, Y, Z, multiple reasons. So the idea of reservation here has actually been questioned, because reservation was for a particular purpose, for an aim, not for just like fixing X number of seats in an institution or for a job for a particular section of society. It was to really uplift and bring everyone to a level to bring about equity rather than equality. So that is one of the major issues that the introduction of the EWS quota actually raised. And if one were to think about the Indra Sahani judgment being questioned, or the 50% quota being called into question, I was thinking of it. You can think of it in two ways. One would say yes, that it's gone to 60% now, so there is it's bypassing what was laid down. But since it's very restrictive in nature, so EWS category quota applies to the people who are economically weaker within the general or unreserved category. So it technically doesn't give reservation to a group outside the general category, but within the general category. So I mean, the question I would raise it: does it like go beyond 50%? Some would say yes, because I mean, at the end of the day, the whole anti-reservation protest was saying this only, that the general category will not get sufficient seats in educational institutions or government jobs. But this is within the general category, so people within your community or within your category are getting an opportunity that maybe they wouldn't get, because the more well-to-do people are getting the same opportunity. But in essence, again, the problem that the EWS quota essentially has is the fact that it is not based on the very principle of why reservations were introduced. And that takes me to one of the final questions of our discussion. Are more quotas the solution, or can a different approach be adopted to address the socio-economic inequality that we see in India? Gayatri, why don't you take that?
Yes, thank you, Amisha. And it's a beautiful segue into this question as well, because one of the other questions that was raised in the judgment was about to what extent can we extend these kind of reservation policies to the private sector as well. And this is where the whole question of are reservations enough also comes into the picture, because traditionally, or rather as it was laid down, reservations is only limited to your public sector. But given that with increasing liberalization since 1990s and given the current government policies as well, we are now seeing a reduction in the number of jobs available in the public sector, and instead we have a lot more private sector jobs and institutions coming up. So if we really want to obtain something like a substantive equality, then it's necessary that we also extend these policies to the private sector so that we can extend the benefit of diverse representation even in these institutions. But now over this, so while a lot of critique was taking place as to whether reservations are enough or not, most of the study has been done mostly related to caste reservations that we had so far. And it's shown that there are many major leakages in this system of reservations, but overall, there has also been a significant advantage that this system has given to the categories of SC, ST, and OBCs. Right? There was one study done on, especially on reservation in railway industries, because it is the largest employer, public employer, where this reservation systems effect can be most carefully studied, right? And they've seen that there has been an increase in the representation of SC, STs, and OBCs in railways in different positions. But there's also a lot of issues, like, for example, there is no further progression of these members in their career because, again, of this social stigma, etc. But when we talk about EWS, like as been discussed so far, there is no concept of like social stigma per se. Even in the judgment, they have acknowledged multiple times that there is nothing necessarily stopping, like in terms of discrimination, there is no discrimination that impedes the growth of economically weaker section to progress in the career, though there is a limitation of the opportunities that they may get in initially because of the lack of resources they have to develop their potential and all of that stuff. So, which is why many studies have suggested that rather than having a reservation policy, anti-discrimination policy when it comes to caste-based quotas, etc., would be effective. And but quotas when it comes to gender inequality and economically weaker sections is rather effective. So there has been this critique that came up. So when we talk about reservations for caste, anti-discrimination policy, which can be extended even to the private sector, because you essentially incentivize these institutions to increase diversity, give more representation and opportunities to certain socially discriminated groups, as opposed to just having um, um, an ineffective representation that takes place to reservations where you just have certain people on the board and then just forget about them, right? Rather than incentivizing and having them take action by themselves is more effective. But when it comes to EWS and, for example, something like gender equality, quotas have been efficient. There has been study of the EU policies that were taking place with a lot of EU countries which have quotas for gender based on gender when it comes to corporations and in government legislative departments. There has been positive evidence that shows that quotas have been very effective and that it can be even more effective if it were to be extended even in the private sector, etc., like has been in the case of corporations having a certain mandated amount of quota for women directors and in managerial positions. So yes, EWS quotas work. Given the unique demand that they have, as opposed to, say, other socially marginalized communities and getting them representation. But it and it can also be extended to the private sector.
Yeah, I think on the lines of reservation, my earlier point about how just extending reservations without really looking at what it stands for. Because I think if you remember in the last couple of years, there's a new concept of domicile-based reservation that was introduced in Haryana and Andhra Pradesh for jobs in the private sector. So the companies therein would have been forced to, let's say, keep X number of I think in some states it was almost 50% of the people in the C and D category jobs for domicile. So that again introduces a new form of reservation. So what essentially is forgotten is that there is a purpose for reservation. It's not just that you allot these number of seats and the job of the government is done. By essentially extending reservations to different categories, yes, reservation has a lot of positives that it can introduce to people of different categories, be it the socially discriminated communities or be it even the economically weaker sections. But what it has now become is it's become a vote bank politics essentially. So the idea of reservations is to uplift people. Upliftment doesn't solely happen by reserving seats. The government has to take up a lot of strategic measures to ensure that it's being implemented. So that is why the introduction of an economic reservation is basically the validation. It's shifting the focus from a collective identity, be it caste or tribal, to more of an individual identity, that is economic deprivation. So you're shifting away from the purpose that it had been introduced for. So if you don't take effective steps in providing, let's say, good quality education, free education to people of economically weaker sections, as well as socially backward sections, or providing ground level frameworks that will help aid you to actually use this reservation. Because to be very honest, over the years there had been a debate that reservations should be done away with. But in a country like India, even today, there is no concept of doing away with it, because you have a lot of social discrimination happening even today. Even on the economic front also there is, but of course the social discrimination is at a much higher level if you go to backward areas, or even to, in fact, even in the so-called modern cities that we live in, you see it on happening on a daily basis, maybe not directly but through indirect measures. And the idea of, let's say, this issue of economic reservation, now that it's come into question, it's been introduced, this will also over time push us to bringing, let's say, a creamy layer concept within the SCs and STs. Because let's say people within these communities generationally have been able to use the reservation policies. It's time, let's say, now to give it to the people who are not really getting it. So within a group of people, there is class hierarchies therein. So this idea of economic reservation, or EWS quota, that has been introduced separately for the general and unreserved category, that will also bring a push towards bringing such a creamy layer, let's say, within the SCs and STs, that will allow for the progress of the people who are not really getting the reservation, and the ones who actually need it are not really getting it. So it raises a lot of complex questions. But I'll hand over to Shreya and then to Arushi.
Yeah. So on the question, like you raised quite a few interesting points, and I feel with in regards to specifically education, this is something that JNU employs, not DU. JNU has a system of deprivation points. So depending on certain categorizations, you get additional deprivation points on a social condition. So caste, SCST is a part of it for sure. Disability is a part of it, and economically weaker section is a part of it. But then there are other versions as well. There is how many earning members do you have in your household? How many educated members do you have in your household? How many are you from a rural area or an urban area? Are you from a tier 1 city or a tier 2 city? All of these factors, if how many stacks basically you've had against you, and it's like a more comprehensive, more quantitative way of assigning value to these. So you know this, like, it's a more comprehensive way of understanding. It's not just basing it of whether or not you belong to this certain caste. It's taking into account a lot of other categorizations as well, which account to maybe your score in a standardized exam being lower than other kids. And I think that's an approach that can certainly be considered, especially with regards to education, because now application forms are happening online. Taking these things into account is getting much easier with CUET and other stuff as well. Applying online, this stuff can be done through with a basic algorithm. And this is something that big universities like DU and Varanasi and other big universities in India should consider applying to their own admission processes for a more, if social upliftment and effective affirmative action is actually what they are aiming for, and not just populating their colleges with upper caste people. I'll hand over to Arushi. I think her hand was up.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about the point that Amisha raised regarding the purpose of bringing about reservations. So, like, reservations are being blatantly misused in today's times, because I remember there was a proposition by the Karnataka High Court also to bring in a reservation for Karnataka domiciles within the High Court. So, like, students that belonging, even in universities of Karnataka, there should have been more domicile for people belonging to the state, people originally speaking the language of the state, in order to have more representation in the education institutions as well as the high courts of that particular state. So I think that the basic point behind the reservation, which is to resist the injustice being perpetrated systematically and socially within the institutions, is sort of being violated by the number of reservations that are being proposed by different states and by different parties in the current time. So I feel bringing about a quota, bringing about a reservation is sort of to mandate, is sort of like a mandatory thing that the government does in order to mandate that these particular people need to deserve a representation, because if we do not have the quota, they will not get the representation. So I feel that particular purpose is sort of missing from the kind of proposals regarding the amendments, regarding the reservations that we're getting in today's time.
Yeah, should I go ahead?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so I have one more point to add, that is about how Arushi mentioned the misuse of reservations. So even in the application of the policy, there is a lot of misuse because the whole creamy layer concept in caste reservations is, I think the creamy layer limit is 8 lakh rupees for OBCs. So, but a lot of people in a lot of areas get fake income certificates made and then get the OBC certificate issued in their name, which helps them get into better institutions and everything. But it seems like a process that can be violated very easily, but reservations being such a important and even a sensitive issue, the government should be more careful while when it is actually being implemented and the actual application is happening, because it the whole process of giving reservation was to bring people to the fore who have been discriminated against, or who have been left back, if I must say so. So but this whole the cuts which happen in the middle, that people are getting fake certificates made through changing their income level, showing a different income level than actually is. I've actually heard and seen cases where they've gone to shops and said, okay, apply for this, but show my income as like 5 lakh rupees instead of 8 lakh rupees, and then they get the reservation, which is not fair. And I would like to make another point which has been made by Shreya already, but it's about how reservation should be more comprehensive. As she mentioned about how it should be about a lot more things than just income or their caste. So Amisha talked about individual reservations, focusing on the individual. So I think that kind of adds up to her to Shriya's point, where it becomes more comprehensive. So instead of a whole caste or a whole class, you're focusing on one person and what the injustice they have faced. We have to keep in mind the history of their caste, of their class, and everything. But at the same time, it should be more individual based than the whole caste, because then again, a lot of people like getting fake certificates made can very easily use it. But if there was a comprehensive process where every aspect would be considered, this person might not get away with it in a way. Obviously, the implementation has to be checked, but if there is a more comprehensive process, then I think even that will be reduced. But it is very important to shift it to an individual. Thank you.
Gayatri and then Arushi.
And also, in general, I fail to understand how exactly quotas for economic weaker section also like work in terms of principle, because the fact that we have quotas for this is a sign of the failure of the government to provide for the economic equality, right? So it all depends on the economic policies that they go. So even when I was searching for other policies that could help reduce income inequality or in general economic equality, all the suggestions that were made by the policy by World Bank and every other institutions were related to the economic policies that the state can implement. None of them have been related to the quotas in any system. And so the fact that we have a huge inequality, economic inequality in our country, is a sign that the state has failed to give have good economic policies in the first place. So having reservations that benefit a very tiny segment of the great population does not really help. So if anything, the very idea of having an economic reservation is entirely flawed, and it's just sort of like a wheel that covers everyone's eyes and helps them ignore the fact that it's the state's problem. The state has manufactured, in fact.
It's interesting that you mentioned economic policy because one could also interpret is the fact that we are so hell-bent on looking for jobs and looking for educational degrees and educational institutions. Is that because like we in our country we constantly promote and we constantly are a part of a culture of competition, but the fact of the matter is the kind of seats we're competing for in a population of 1.3 billion is it's insanely low. It's insanely low and can in no way accommodate the kind of educational demand the students have said. And I mean, this is something that a professor in economics constantly said. Like if you have a population of this much, that means you also have the ability to generate that much taxes. You also have should have the ability. It should all correspond. It's not just that the population is high, it means the taxes should also be high, the kind number of teachers should also be high, the number of education institutions should also be high. That is what a government should be ensuring, should be hell-bent on ensuring, not figuring out ways to cut down and understand and kind of reconstruct how already prevalent educational institutions look. The number of seats available for medical colleges, which I mean, statistically speaking, it's I think it's a couple of hundred times harder to get into AIMS than it is AIMS or any other medical known top 10 or whatever medical college than to get into Harvard. I mean, these are insane statistics. So does the focus of the government at this point in time really have to be on in how many ways they can orchestrate more upper castes in these institutions, or to just focus on putting money towards more institutions? uh, I mean, another thing that was raised, another thing about casteism that has been constantly talked about, especially as students of Jindal, that is a discussion that is often brought up, is look at Jindal itself, look at the student body population, look at how many look at how many students, how many of your friends, most of your friends are upper caste. What does that speak to? This is a private choice that a lot of families are making to send their students to their children to a private institution, which is very expensive. It's because they're able to, and those who are able to are upper caste. So yeah, Devansh, go ahead.
Yeah, now that you mentioned the whole medical thing, same, not same, but a similar situation occurs in law, where for the UG program there are 1300 seats, right? 1300 seats, I think 1300, and there are 60 to 70,000 people who are taking the seat, who are taking the exam, like CLAT. So, and that is the only way to enter a college, to enter the NLUs. So it seems like if I round it off, it's 1300, 80,000 people took CLAT last year, the year I gave it in 2021. So if we divide that 13 is to 80, if I divide it, it's going to turn out into some math, but it's very visible that there are very less college seats. So a lot of people argue that, oh, we should we should remove reservation because whatever reason. But another argument that could be made, we need to increase the number of seats in college. Only if we are talking about the academics part of it, but we need to include the number, increase the number of seats, number of teachers, as Shreya mentioned, and number of colleges, obviously, because it just seems very unfair and to ask so many people to compete for so less seats, and then and then you don't, like, people end up going to private institutions like Jindal, which even itself, till a point, a lot of corporates didn't want to hire from. It's only after a point when the students, the alumni, started doing really well, then Jindal was considered like a good institution, and now it's where it is. But before, even now, there are a lot of private colleges which the corporates don't hire from, which again puts other people into a very, in a at a place of huge disadvantage. So I don't think the whole thing makes sense.
I think the both of you have raised a really Good point. And if you were to think about it, why do people from the general category really oppose reservation? It's not, I mean, there will be a small percentage who have an issue with the fundamental idea behind it, but most of the people really oppose it because it's giving someone else an opportunity at like my cost. But why should that be a problem that we should suffer as citizens? It's something that the state is responsible to cater for. Of course, there'll never be a situation where everyone gets what they want, but to say that 1% or 5% of the population is all that's going to get something is very unfair. You have to cater to the rising needs. And I won't get into the economics behind it, but definitely there can be many more educational institutions that can be set up, because there is a lack of there's this very severe unemployment in the country. So the more institutions you set up, the more employment it will generate. But somehow over the years, reservation just has been taken as a tool for used as a tool by the government to just wash away its hands with everything. Like you've introduced reservation, okay, the people can take care of themselves. You're not aiding um, this reservation with what it needs to be given. Like, you need to provide good education, you need to provide facilities at the ground level. You may have introduced reservation that will get you into a school or get you into a college, but do you really have access to other opportunities that you need beside it? You may give a person from the educationally backward or educationally socially backward section a seat in a particular college, but does that person then have the funds to really make complete use of the opportunities being given to them? No. Again, someone who's doing financially better or who's socially better off will again be able to make more use of the opportunity given to them. So just by giving reservation is not the answer. So this is making us deviate from the question of whether EWS quota is good or not. But again, reservation in itself needs to be aided with a lot many things before it to really make sense, because when the constitution makers introduced reservation in the first place, they had envisaged a India where there wouldn't be reservation after a couple of decades. But if we're what, almost 60, 70 years post independence, and we still have not been able to achieve what they had thought of. They thought that we'll be able to create a situation where there's equity, where there's equality across classes, but there isn't. So I think there's a lot more that needs to be done on part of the state, the government, to really bring about this equity, because simply awarding reservation to more and more groups is not the answer. Because if you're not able to actualize what was intended, then what's the point of introducing reservation? Yeah, Shreya.
Also, Devansh, just the statistic part of it, just solve it. So I'm just saying. So as per 80,000 candidates for CLAT and 1,300 seats, that would mean an acceptance rate of, so that's one in every 61 people, something of the sort, and that would mean acceptance rate of around 1.5%. Harvard's acceptance rate is 5%. So
See, and
that
we are just
this is
comparing. Okay,
law.
no, I'm not even
This
gonna
is
say it
law.
because
This is
that
law. This is law. Let's not even.
exactly.
Medical is even more zeros in the front. All right. Medical and engineering and IIT and all of these. I mean, the number of people who go for JEE. This we have an insane demand for education at every step of the way. You have a government and you have a private sector that's trying to come up with ways to satisfy the demand, but it's not happening
And
for
for
the
what?
costs.
Sorry.
Yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
And for what? Education, which is like a basic right, a quality education, which is the basic right, which is the source of everything for a person, for their well-being, for their health, for their life. I'm not saying people who don't get a degree can't do anything, but come on, I mean, seriously, like, it's you, our constitution guarantees good education, but are we getting it at every place? No. In either make in all institutes that are there become all the local government colleges or state government colleges so good that people can go there, but we all know their conditions. So instead of that, there are, you just get 10 NLUs, let's take law, 10 NLUs, and you ask so many kids to compete, 61 people giving for one seat. I mean, I don't know how that makes sense, seriously. Like,
Yes, Arushi.
Yeah, I don't, it's not, and right now we're just discussing about higher education, but even primary education is in a very bad state. So higher education, okay, you consider an amount of privilege when you get access to higher education in a country like India, even though it should not be like that. But basic primary education is also not available to the majority of the population that is required for the basic sustenance of life. And then on that, regarding the end, if you're taking into consideration the law aspect only, the public mindset regarding the government universities is well versus the private universities is also a hindrance into the purpose of achieving employment in the country, right? So like you're perceived to be of a certain merit if you go into a government institution versus a private institution. So it's not about making education accessible to all or making good quality education accessible to all. It's also that you sort of get like an upper hand privilege or sort of a meritorious label or tag when you belong to a certain kind of an institution in India. So it's not about the education that the institution gives, it's also about the legacy and the tag and the label that the institution comes with. So yeah.
Also going back to economically
sorry.
weaker section, how that corresponds to it. Um, I think that's like it's interesting that we're talking about higher education and the number of people competing for higher education seats. But to bring it back, so if you look at a household which has a consumer expenditure of around 80 to 83 buck, between the range of 83 rupees a day, I think, to 1250, which is nominal. If you look at the caste division, the class and caste divisions of this capacity, you look at so Hindu belonging backward classes have a higher education rate of 2.8% here. You have those with, so SC ST, I think they ST is less than 1%, by the way. SC is around 1.5%. I can share the statistics later. But if you look at upper caste households in the same expenditure limit, they are at 7%. 7% of them have a higher education degree. So people who belong to economically weaker sections, who belong to the upper caste, already have a better access to higher education degrees. And we're giving that specific group more reservations instead of just giving an umbrella reservation to the whole economically weaker section. So I think that's an interesting point to consider again in how many degrees India can afford, kind of thing.
Thanks so much for that extremely insightful and fun discussion. To wrap up, I'd just say that the introduction of the EWS quota was a good idea in terms of what it aimed to do, a good objective, but it goes against the very essence of why reservations were introduced in the first place to correct historical injustices, social injustice that was that particular communities were subjected to. But the concept of reservation in itself requires a lot more to be done on part of the government to really actualize the reason why reservations are introduced in the first place. Just simply allotting a particular number of seats in educational institutions or in terms of employment is not the sole answer. That is just a stepping stone to achieve a greater idea of equity. So there's a lot more that needs to be done on part of the government. But our reservations good is the EWS.
Misha, you got muted. I don't know how.
Was I muted throughout or?
No, just like the last couple of seconds.
Okay, no. So I was just saying that whether reservations are a good idea or not, it's a never-ending discussion. When should reservations stop? Who should be the people getting reservations? Should a creamy layer be introduced in SC/STs? It's a debate that goes on and on. You'll have different research coming on both sides. But with that, we draw to a close, and we look forward to seeing you in our discussion for December. Thank you.